Archived picked feed loops and field notes converge on a single, recurring set of signatures, long vertical strips of fused alloy and slag. Ring segment drydocks whose scale is measured in kilometers rather than meters. Maintenance gondolas the size of habitation blocks, and the persistent background of industrial chorus, weld fire, hydraulic thump, and the low resonant Doppler of orbital tugs. Witness statements submitted during initial survey operations describe a workspace that is simultaneously active and abandoned. Sensors recorded intermittent power cycles in maintenance bays and automated rig frames that continued to cycle despite no recorded human presence. A preliminary radiometric profile suggested ancient reactors operating at fractional output, consistent with maintenance subroutines rather than full-scale manufacture. Excavation teams reported salvaged crates stamped with pre-Imperial sigla and fragments of identification bands from long-defunct naval houses. Field telemetry and archival picked feeds indicate that the complex has been reworked and reoccupied multiple times across the pre-Imperial Age of Strife, the Unification Wars, and the early Great Crusade. The site preserves stratified engineering layers, early weld frames and wooden scaffolding from primal shipwright periods, mid-era pneumatic cranes and arc smithing pits associated with centralized fleet construction, and later articulated exo-riveters and automated hull bath arrays consistent with mechanized forge doctrines. Forensic analysis of slag composition returned signatures of rare alloys and stabilizing compounds associated with Saturnine pattern armaments and heavy frame production. These combined signals, when cross-referenced with surviving Navarch records and fragmentary ledger prints, confirm the complex as a principal shipbuilding locus in the Sol system over multiple eras. This dossier compiles on-site picked feed extracts, eyewitness testimonies from salvage crews and administratum observers, and preliminary material analysis conducted by attached Mechanicus liaisons. The complex named in contemporary records as the Saturnine orbital forges is the subject of the following report. The Shipyards of Saturn. Report compiled by civilian and administratum surveyors records the site as a mosaic of orbital and ring-borne facilities distributed across several of Saturn's larger moons and the artificial platforms that occupy its rings. High-resolution picked feed reconstructions show concentric ring drydocks, segmented slipways carved into shepherd moon regolith, and a series of hollowed orbital bastions that functioned as both foundries and defensive batteries. Some drydock segments are open to Saturn's ring plane and use gravitational wells to assist in material transfer. Others are enclosed, sealed behind plasma shutters and shield coils. The structural language across the complex is coherent. Long keelways, segmented assembly nodes, and a persistent presence of heavy gantries and ballast tethers intended for the manipulation of city-scale hull sections. Profiles of construction technique vary within the complex, indicating phases of refurbishment and doctrinal shifts. Early construction phases emphasize labor-intensive smithing and rivet craft, supported by human crews and servitors. Later layers exhibit the dominance of cogitator-guided fabrication and automated exo-forge systems attributed to Adeptus Mechanicus intervention. Certain orbital bastions display architectural features associated with naval heavy industries, integrated armament foundries, calibration vaults for lance and macrocannon assemblies, and segregated manufacture zones for void engines and gravitic compensators. Survey teams note the deliberate compartmentalization of offensive systems, suggesting a procedural doctrine that isolated strategic components, both physically and through ritualized cogitator rites. These sacramental practices are consistent with Mechanicus records that describe similar segregation on forge worlds and major fleet yards. Material evidence recovered during controlled entries corroborates archival claims that the site was a major contributor to pre-Imperial and early Imperium ship construction. Core samples and slag inclusions contained signatures consistent with Saturnine alloy recipes and high-density ballast compounds used in heavy battleship keel plating. Micro-inscriptions discovered on bulkheads and rivet plates match registry marks later attributed to Saturnine naval houses and to manufacturing batches catalogued in fragmentary Great Crusade manifests. These marks, along with ledger fragments that reference dock index cycles, indicate organized, repeated production schedules rather than one-off construction. The complexity and redundancy of the shipyard's logistical architecture, multiple redundant slipways, automated transfer conduits, and long-term storage vaults, support the conclusion that the site served strategic, continuous shipbuilding functions rather than only episodic manufacture. Eyewitness reports from salvage operatives and administratum stewards are consistent in their description of the shipyard's scale and the atmospheric impression it created. Operators who served on reclamation barges recall the first approach as a disorienting corridor of hull strata and scaffold shadows, a place where scale and depth collapsed into a continuous industrial horizon. Senior artificer liaisons recorded that much of the complex was designed to be largely self-sustaining. Ore refineries tied to ring harvesters, automated smelters capable of processing raw rock into usable ingots, and cold fusion cores that sustained low-level operations for centuries. Several testimonies describe encountering automated maintenance crews operating under corrupted command matrices, servitors executing archaic maintenance sequences with no valid oversight, and diagnostic cogitators running ancient ritual processes that resisted modern reinitialization. Field log excerpts show Mechanicus teams proceeding with reverent caution when interfacing with on-site cogitators, noting anomalous liturgies embedded within maintenance scripts that suggested localized rites adapted over generations of technicians. Geospatial analysis of the facility's distribution reveals a clear strategic logic. Platforms and docks located on inner moons and ring segments handle initial assembly and heavy keel formation. These sites are robustly armoured and sit deeper within Saturn's magnetospheric protection, reducing exposure to radiation spikes and facilitating large-scale anchoring during assembly. Outer platforms and retrograde slips served as calibration and acceptance yards, where completed hulls underwent engine trials and weapons integration before departure to interplanetary lanes. The allocation of tasks across nodes permitted simultaneous fabrication of multiple classes of vessel, from escort corvettes to capital vessels, in a modular fashion that allowed parts produced on different moons to be joined in orbit. Administratum personnel cross-referenced orbital lanes and transfer logs that demonstrate a mature schedule of vectoring and transfer that optimized ring mechanics and minimized propellant consumption during assembly maneuvers. Mechanicus analytical teams prioritize study of the site's manufacturing technologies. Their initial reports highlight an advanced integration of archaic ritual smithcraft and systemic automation. Forging pits exhibit layered control matrices that combine electroarc manipulation with servo-guided exoriveters. Certain vaults contained pattern weld cores and calibrating lattices that, when reconstructed, indicate the shipyards were capable of producing not only hull forms, but also Saturnine pattern-heavy systems later noted in Legionary War archives. The coexistence of artisanal techniques and cogitator-directed manufacture suggests a continuous cultural lineage, shipwright traditions preserved by human artisans, overlaid with Mechanicus optimization programs. This hybrid model produced unique manufacturing artifacts, component assemblies that bear both handcrafted markers and precision cogitator signatures. Mechanicus commentary frames this as an evolutionary stage in ship construction, where ceremony and computation coexisted within production cycles. Operational records and recovered manifests sketch a timeline of the shipyard's functional apex and subsequent decline. Ledger fragments indicate intensive output during the latter phase of the Unification Wars and early Great Crusade. During that period, the shipyards functioned as a regional manufacturing heart, supplying vessels and refit services to the nascent Imperial Navy and the Saturnine fleet. Later entries reflect bureaucratic reassignment and the gradual absorption of specific shipbuilding responsibilities by more centralized forge worlds. As parts of the Imperium's industrial apparatus consolidated, the shipyards transitioned into specialized roles: niche pattern production, ordnance calibration, and storage of reserve hulls. The shift towards specialization coincided with increased Mechanicus oversight and a concomitant rise in ritualized manufacture, particularly where rare alloys and pattern engraved systems were concerned. Several anomalies complicate a linear narrative of development. First, there exist material and inscriptional residues that predate known Saturnine political structures, implying some shipbuilding presence on the moons before the formal organization of the Saturnine fleet. Second, picked feed layers show episodes of sudden abandonment and reactivation that do not align with documented large-scale conflicts in the surviving Imperial chronologies. These gaps could indicate undocumented incursions, localized ecological hazards, or administrative concealments. Third, consistent traces of Inquisition seals and quarantine markers across peripheral platforms suggest that segments of the complex were subject to selective censorship or containment during certain eras. Administratum correspondence recovered in sealed ledgers references quarantined bays and sealed vectors, though the reasons cited are redacted or replaced with lacunae in the surviving print. The presence of Inquisition markers implies an operational intersection between fleet manufacture and investigative or containment priorities. For field teams, the practical implications of these findings are immediate. The shipyards present both material opportunity and systemic risk. Recovered components and hull fragments represent significant engineering value, especially to any faction capable of recoding onboard maintenance matrices and reconditioning power plants. At the same time, the persistence of corrupted automation and sealed bays suggests latent hazards. Self-repairing hull sections with unverified patterning, containment vaults, whose sealing protocols have degraded, and ritual code embedded in maintenance routines that may trigger unanticipated operations if reactivated. Mechanicus advisories recommend cautious interfacing. All recovered systems should be isolated and gradually interrogated through sanctioned write and data sifting processes to prevent catastrophic feedback or unintended activation of defensive arrays. Administratum guidance emphasizes evidence collection and cataloging over salvage exploitation until full analyses can be completed and cross-referenced with central arcana. The combined picked feed reconstructions, material studies and eyewitness reports form a connected, if incomplete, portrait of a shipbuilding complex that served the Sol system's naval infrastructure across multiple epochs. Its technological strata reveal cycles of innovation, centralization, and ritualization, while its spatial architecture demonstrates integrated manufacturing logistics designed to leverage Saturn's unique ring mechanics. Redacted documents and Inquisition markers indicate that certain elements of the shipyard's history were subject to deliberate suppression or containment. Subsequent parts of this dossier will trace the site's biological, environmental and human interfaces, document the flora and fauna associated with its moons and installation peripheries, and examine key events and final fates found in interconnected records. The environmental dimensions of the Saturnine shipyards do not exist as a single ecosystem, but as a distributed collection of habitats, fabricated structures, partially terraformed pockets, and natural satellite environments that evolved under varying degrees of industrial pressure. When investigators began compiling environmental profiles, the first challenge was defining what qualified as native. Many zones had endured centuries of mechanized influence, atmospheric tampering, and resource extraction. Others maintained pristine, low-interference conditions due to their distance from primary industrial rings. The result is a patchwork of environments shaped as much by human and mechanicus intervention as by the natural properties of Saturn's moons and ring plane. Early administratum surveyors concluded that no biological environment within the shipyard network could be considered fully natural in the strict scientific sense. Every surface, from industrial platforms to ice-heavy regolith, bore signatures of habitation, resource harvesting, or defensive retrofitting. Yet traces of organic life persist across numerous nodes, often in forms that adapted to the strict atmospheric and energetic constraints imposed by close proximity to a giant gas planet. In many cases, flora and fauna developed not in open landscapes but in narrow pressure pockets carved into infrastructure, shielded caverns, or sealed maintenance corridors where temperature and air composition stabilize long enough to permit basic ecological processes. These organisms never grew into complex interdependent ecologies. Instead, they formed micro-communities bound tightly to the artificial niches generated by centuries of shipyard function. The moons that host core shipyard segments remain the easiest environments to document. Titan, Rhea, Dionair, and Enceladus each contain sites where ancient shipwrights established gravity-stable workshops and structural stabilization anchors. These locations provided foundational geography for later Mechanicus expansions. The most heavily used facilities sit on Titan, which offered stable surface conditions and atmospheric density that simplified sealing and pressure operations. Titan's geography is dominated by thick layers of organic-rich ice, methane lakes, and hydrocarbon dunes. In areas untouched by heavy construction, the terrain resembles a broad, subdued landscape of dark, sandy plains and low ridges shaped by slow, continuous particulate drift. The heavy haze of Titan's atmosphere, consisting primarily of nitrogen and methane with dense aerosols suspended throughout, produces a dim, orange-brown illumination even in full daylight. For early workers and surveyors, the visual field felt compressed, with light scattering so thoroughly through haze particles that distant objects appeared blurred or softened. Whenever observers walked beyond the illuminated perimeters of active work zones, their visors recorded a near-featureless transition into shadowed haze. Over time, the construction of enclosed bays and pressure domes created internal microclimates distinct from Titan's natural environment. Residual humidity from human presence, equipment exhaust, and decompression cycles led to the formation of stable condensation patterns inside certain sealed structures. Where carbon-based dust collected along seams, microbial colonies developed. These simple organisms lacked anything resembling higher structure, existing mostly as thin biofilms or filamentous mats clinging to equipment housings. Exobiologists describe them as opportunistic extremophiles, originating from worker contamination or trace organic matter carried from other moons. Their persistence demonstrates the ability of low-complexity life to exploit artificial pockets of moisture and warmth, even within a harsh nitrogen-methane ambient composition. These organisms never reached a meaningful role in the system's mechanics, but they illustrate the unintentional ecosystems generated by centuries of industrial occupation. Rhea and Dion exhibit a different environmental character. Their surfaces are composed primarily of water ice, fractured by tectonic stress and long-term bombardment from micrometeoroids. The geography is stark, reflective, and sharply defined under the low-angle sunlight that reaches them. Temperatures remain far below freezing, with surface conditions allowing little room for organic stability. Nevertheless, sealed subsurface caverns created during mining operations house controlled atmospheres for materials processing. Inside these excavated pockets, ambient temperatures rose to near human operational levels. Over centuries of use, these conditions provided another vector for microbial persistence. Survey teams detected no complex organisms, but several sealed caverns displayed biosignatures identical to strains transported across Saturn's moon network during the early shipbuilding era. These colonies were dormant by the time of rediscovery, suggesting they had lost their energy sources when machinery shut down during the shipyard's multiple abandonment cycles. Enceladus presents the most unusual case because of its natural cryovolcanic activity. Plumes of water vapor, salts, and organic compounds vent from fissures along its southern hemisphere, forming a tenuous but chemically rich exosphere. When the Mechanicus established temporary shipyard annexes on Enceladus, they constructed reinforced arches above several fissure lines to capture plume material for industrial synthesis. As a byproduct of this resource exploitation, sealed processing chambers accumulated heat from engines and reactors. The combination of warmth, water vapor, and organic components created localized, short-lived biological potential. Unlike Titan, where biofilms formed on metallic surfaces, Enceladus's sheltered chambers generated loosely structured microbial fogs, microscopic clusters suspended in vapor, drifting across processing spaces in slow circulation patterns. These fogs dissipated whenever operations ceased, leaving only faint organic residues on intake ducts and cooling vents. Outside these artificial niches, Saturn's shipyards are defined not by biology, but by extreme meteorological and spatial conditions. Saturn's rings create an environment that fluctuates between high particle density and sudden empty voids. Dust and ice fragments ranging from microscopic grains to multimeter slabs drift unpredictably. The geography of this orbital region is not fixed in the traditional sense. Rather, it is a fluid environment shaped by gravitational resonance between Saturn and its many moons. Shipyard structures built into the rings must counter constant impact risks from drifting material. To manage this hazard, shipyard segments incorporate kinetic deflectors and hardened shielding that distribute force across reinforcement lattices. When viewed from within, the environment resembles a continuous blizzard of ice particles drifting past reinforced windows, each fragment streaking with a faint reflective shimmer from Saturn's distant sunlight. Meteorological patterns across the shipyard complex vary slowly but meaningfully. On Titan, seasonal changes in Saturn's orbital tilt affect haze density, methane cloud behavior, and the thermal gradient across surface regions. During Titan's warmer periods, methane lakes undergo evaporation cycles that thicken low-atmosphere cloud layers. Surface temperatures rise only slightly, but enough to shift pressure gradients inside constructed domes and sealed excavation chambers. These shifts forced shipyard engineers to recalibrate airlocks, pressure seals, and environmental processes multiple times throughout each Titan season. Logs indicate that early workers learned to recognize subtle haze variations as signs of approaching changes in surface temperature or atmospheric density. On Rhea and Dione, meteorology is shaped primarily by the Moon's exposure to Saturn's magnetosphere. Charged particles from Saturn's radiation belts bombard their surfaces, creating electrostatic events that produce faint auroral glows. These displays are weak compared to planetary auroras, but provide intermittent atmospheric illumination during periods of high magnetic activity. Mechanicus engineers sometimes recorded these auroral patterns as disturbances in equipment diagnostics, interpreting them as environmental noise that had to be filtered out when calibrating fabrication arrays. The most dramatic meteorological effect across the entire network is not found on any moon but within the rings themselves. The constant motion of ring particles creates a low-grade acoustic phenomenon detectable through hull plating and structural supports. Workers often describe this as a continuous, distant vibration that resembled industrial machinery, even when no active systems were present. The vibration varied depending on the density of surrounding particles. When rings grew crowded, the resonance intensified, producing a steady, low hum. When density thinned, the hum faded to a faint, irregular tapping. This ambient resonance shaped worker perception of the environment and became part of navigational routines for pilots of supply craft and short-range shuttles. Flora is nearly absent across the entire Saturnine system. Investigators found no complex plant analogues, no mosses, and no structured photosynthetic organisms. The moons receive too little light, and their ambient temperatures remain hostile to plant metabolism. Any organic structures found in sealed chambers lacked chlorophyll-based functions and survived solely through chemical interactions with industrial byproducts or contaminated air cycles. As such, the ecological structure of the shipyards is defined by pressure-resistant microbial forms rather than traditional flora. Fauna is equally limited. No multicellular organisms native to Saturn's moons ever reach stable populations within the shipyards. The only exceptions involve small contaminant species transported unintentionally by early human workers. Records mention maintenance rodents aboard construction vessels and minor arthropod species capable of surviving low humidity and intermittent food supplies. These species only survived inside pressurized modules and never escaped into moon environments. When the shipyards entered periods of abandonment, these organisms died out quickly. Their skeletal remains, discovered inside sealed compartments, provide the only evidence that such fauna ever existed there. From a geographical perspective, the shipyards represent a layered structure of natural terrain and artificial modification. Titan's ridged dunes hide reinforced foundations for drydocks. Rhea's icy plains are punctured by shafts leading to subsurface bays. Dian's fractured crust contains anchor points for gravitational stabilizers. Enceladus's fissures contain the remnants of industrial arches used to capture vapor plumes. Beyond these physical footprints, massive orbital facilities float above the moon surfaces, held steady by thruster arrays and stabilizing fields. Each orbital platform contains kilometers of internal corridors, reinforcement struts, hull fabrication bays, void-exposed scaffolds, and heat-shielded engine test chambers. The architecture of these stations follows mechanized principles rather than aesthetic ones. Function over form, reinforcement over curvature, logic over ornament. Within these constructed environments, temperature gradients, humidity levels, and atmospheric composition vary according to functional role. Engine testing segments maintain high heat and exhaust pressure. Hull assembly areas retain colder atmospheres to prevent alloy warping. Storage vaults operate under low humidity to limit corrosion. The meteorological conditions of each chamber reflect its task, rather than any natural environmental rhythm. Where life coexists with these structures, it does so incidentally. Microbial colonies form in the seams between pressure panels. Organic residues accumulate in condensation traps. Trace extremophils in sealed chambers respond to the slightest environmental shift, expanding or collapsing based on the availability of heat and moisture. The flora and fauna of the Saturnine shipyards are not ecosystems in the traditional sense, but artifacts of human and mechanicus activity, remnants of biological contamination adapting to isolated niches. Despite the presence of these biological traces, the environment remains dominated by mechanical and astronomical forces. Saturn's gravity well shapes supply routes, shuttle trajectories, and orbital decay patterns. The magnetosphere influences sensor performance, equipment longevity, and occasional power fluctuations. Micrometeoroid impact patterns determine maintenance cycles for external plating. The rings generate a constant threat of structural abrasion. Across every node of the complex, workers and machines navigate an environment defined by celestial mechanics first, and biological opportunity second. Investigators preparing environmental dossiers for the Administratum emphasized a key conclusion. Life did not flourish in the shipyards. It tolerated them. The ecosystems that emerged were reactions to industrial residue, water vapor pockets, and artificial containment. Geography and meteorology shaped the architecture of ship construction, not the trajectory of biological development. Shipyards on Earth or Mars might have fostered more complex ecological overlap, but the Saturnine environment remained fundamentally hostile to sustained, diverse life. With this environmental profile established, the next section of the chapter will trace the chronological development of major events across the shipyard's network and outline the documented or inferred final fates of the primary construction nodes. The historical sequence of the Saturnine shipyards is defined by long cycles of expansion, stagnation, abandonment, and reconstruction. The region never developed along a simple linear path. Instead, each era layered new infrastructure atop older frameworks that still bore the marks of previous technological standards, political priorities, and industrial doctrines. When archivists map the timeline, they typically begin with the earliest exploratory expeditions that reached Saturn during the Age of Technology. These early ventures identified the gas giant's gravity well, and moon systems as ideal anchors for long-range construction platforms. The industrial logic was simple. The outer system offered abundant raw materials in the form of ice, hydrocarbons, and ring debris, while maintaining distance from inner system political conflicts. The first stable industrial nodes emerged on Titan. Unlike the airless moons, Titan's thick atmosphere provided a natural buffer against radiation and micrometeoroid impacts. Survey logs note that the earliest landing parties selected a broad plain on Titan's equatorial region as the site of the primary settlement. This plain offered firm ground, mild elevation gradients, and proximity to hydrocarbon lakes suitable for fuel processing. The pioneers established sealed pressure domes, fabricated atmospheric processors, and constructed initial drydock frames capable of supporting medium-sized exploratory craft. At this stage, operations focused not on warship production, but on deep space research vessels, mining haulers, and long-range utility ships needed for scientific expansion. By the late age of technology, Titan's shipyards had grown into a sprawling multi-node system. Orbital segments anchored above Titan's atmosphere connected to ground facilities through elevator pylons and shuttle paths. Saturn's rings became extraction grounds for alloy precursors and rare volatile compounds. Rhea and Dion hosted subterranean research chambers. Enceladus became a natural source of water vapor and organic compounds. The entire system functioned as an integrated logistics network, with each moon contributing specialized materials or environmental advantages to a broader industrial ecosystem. This first era of construction ended abruptly during the onset of the Age of Strife. Warp storms severed communication routes, disrupted long-distance transport, and isolated the Saturnine system along with the rest of the outer worlds. Many shipyard segments fell into disuse as maintenance crews dwindled and supply chains collapsed. Titan remained the primary operational node but lost significant production capacity as reactor components failed and replacement materials never arrived. The moons of Rhea and Dion retained functional power sources but operated far below capacity due to the loss of personnel and command oversight. During this decline, several sealed chambers across the moons accumulated damage from environmental drift, internal pressure failures, or structural fatigue. Some abandoned caverns collapsed entirely, burying dormant equipment under layers of ice or hydrocarbon sediment. Others froze into stasis conditions that preserved their contents for millennia, resulting in later rediscovery of intact Age of Technology artifacts. The people who lived and worked in these shipyards during the decline experienced increasingly unstable conditions. Records recovered from Titan's deep data caches indicate that workers relied on improvised repairs to sustain air supply and power. As conditions worsened, groups fled from one node to another seeking more stable infrastructure. This migration pattern created a patchwork of temporary habitation zones across Titan, Rhea, and certain orbital platforms. Key events during this era include the collapse of the Titan primary dome, recorded as a structural failure caused by corroded load-bearing supports. Emergency logs describe a catastrophic pressure loss that forced surviving workers to evacuate into the secondary drydock tunnels. The collapse triggered a chain reaction across attached facilities, shutting down several ground-based production lines. This event effectively ended large-scale construction capacity prior to the unification of Terra. With the rise of the Emperor and the eventual reintroduction of the outer system into Imperial structure, Saturn's shipyards entered a new era. The Mechanicum of Mars deployed restoration forces, salvage crews, and tech adepts to reclaim lost infrastructure. Multiple nodes were rebuilt from ground level, while others were integrated into newer Mechanicus designs. Titan's importance grew significantly once the Imperium began preparing for the Great Crusade. The Moon became a major shipbuilding hub, producing hulls, engine arrays, and structural frameworks for the rapidly expanding Imperial fleet. During the Great Crusade, the Saturnine shipyards reached their largest scale in recorded history. Titan's drydocks constructed cruiser hulls and transport vessels. Orbital platforms fabricated drive components for expeditionary fleets. Rhea and Dione produced armored plating and specialized alloys. Enceladus contributed volatile compounds used in reactor cooling systems. This multi-moon network supported the mass production demand needed to sustain a galaxy-spanning military campaign. Logs from this era indicate continuous activity across all major nodes, with supply craft moving in synchronized patterns between shipyards and transport routes carrying completed vessels toward the inner system. A notable event during this period was the introduction of advanced mechanized assembly protocols. The Mechanicum implemented synchronized fabrication lines capable of operating with minimal human oversight. This transition accelerated ship production and increased structural uniformity across fleet classes. Titan's orbital platforms became particularly efficient, capable of assembling large hull sections within days rather than weeks. The introduction of these protocols also marked the beginnings of tension between Mechanicus doctrine and human worker presence. Many ground-based personnel were reassigned, displaced, or replaced by automated systems. The shipyard's golden era ended when the Horus Heresy erupted. As the Imperium fractured, Saturn's shipyards gained immense strategic importance. Control of Titan, its orbital platforms, and its associated moon facilities meant control of a portion of the Imperium's warship supply. Although the primary conflict unfolded across the inner system, Saturn played a critical logistical role. Loyalist forces fortified the shipyards, reinforcing orbital rings, activating defense cannons, and sealing off auxiliary nodes to prevent sabotage. Some shipyard segments were evacuated entirely, while others entered emergency lockdown procedures. Several records describe attempts by traitor-aligned forces to disrupt ship production by targeting orbital platforms. Defensive batteries installed across Titan's upper atmosphere intercepted most incursions. Other facilities sustained structural damage from stray fire or debris impacts, but none were completely destroyed. The shipyard's relative distance from direct naval engagements protected them from the full intensity of the war, but not from indirect consequences such as supply shortages, reactor instabilities, and personnel loss. A pivotal event during this era was the reinforcement of Titan by a contingent of the Emperor's loyalists prior to the Siege of Terra. These forces ensured that the shipyards continued to support the loyalist fleet during the final stages of the conflict. While Mars itself fell into civil war between loyalist and traitor Mechanicum factions, Saturn's facilities remained under secure loyalist influence. This stability kept critical supply lines functional when most other industrial hubs became compromised. After the heresy, the repairs and reconstruction effort across the solar system extended to Saturn. Many facilities required extensive work to restore full capacity, especially those damaged indirectly through power fluctuations or resource scarcity. Titan's shipyards eventually returned to production, though at a slower pace as the Imperium redirected attention toward rebuilding and stabilizing core territories. Several auxiliary nodes on Rhea, Dion, and Enceladus were abandoned due to insufficient personnel and lack of strategic necessity. Others were sealed intentionally when the Mechanicus determined that maintaining them posed more risk than benefit due to structural instability or outdated systems. During the long millennia of the Imperium's stagnation, Saturn's shipyards oscillated between moderate production and periods of near dormancy. Titan remained the only consistently active site. Many orbital platforms continued to operate but at reduced capacity, producing smaller vessels or conducting maintenance repairs on damaged fleets. The outer nodes degraded more rapidly, especially those on Rhea and Dion, where ice movement gradually destabilized older subterranean chambers. Throughout the era of total war that defines Millennia 41, Saturn's shipyards played a consistent although diminished role. The Imperium faced constant pressure from Xenos incursions, internal corruption, and logistical scarcity. Despite these challenges, Titan's shipyards maintained a steady output of vessels, components, and replacement parts, crucial to the continued survival of Imperial fleets. Several documented defense actions occurred during these millennia, including repelling raider strikes that attempted to disrupt production. These attacks rarely penetrated deep into the system due to strong Imperial patrols. The final fate of the Saturnine shipyards is not defined by a single catastrophic event, but by gradual transformation and selective abandonment. Titan remains the core shipyard and continues functioning as part of the Imperium's solar industrial complex. Its drydocks still produce hulls, engine assemblies, and structural frameworks. Orbital platforms above Titan remain active, though many operate with reduced workforce and increased mechanization. They carry the accumulated architectural layers of thousands of years of repairs, upgrades, and retrofits. Rhea's facilities deteriorated the most. Subterranean bays collapsed due to shifting ice layers. Reactor cores froze and stalled. Some chambers remain intact but sealed permanently. Administratum reports classify most Rhea nodes as non-functional archival sites with restricted access. Dion's nodes share a similar fate, though a few stabilizers remain active but unmanned, maintaining structural integrity to prevent orbital debris from impacting other nearby installations. Enceladus retains a limited role due to its valuable cryovolcanic resources. The Mechanicus still harvests plume material for targeted purposes, though the older industrial arches are long defunct. Modern equipment performs extraction with safer and more efficient methods. Most legacy structures were either dismantled or collapsed beneath shifting ice. The orbital platforms distributed through Saturn's ring plane remain the most diverse in fate. Some operate continuously as part of Titan's extended production network. Others drift without active crew, preserved only by automated systems cycling on and off at irregular intervals. Certain platforms turned into archival storage after their fabrication roles ended, holding components, prototypes, or experimental materials from earlier technological eras. A few were intentionally scuttled when their positions became hazardous due to ring drift or structural fatigue. When the Administratum compiled its final fate assessment for Saturn's shipyards, it described the region as a partially active, multi-era industrial cluster. One node persists as a major production hub. Several auxiliary nodes function at reduced capacity. Many peripheral nodes stand abandoned but structurally intact. Others collapsed into irretrievable ruin. The entire system, once envisioned as a unified shipbuilding empire, now exists as a layered archive of the Imperium's industrial history. Every remaining drydock, tunnel, and orbital armature reflects a different technological era preserved by distance and necessity. As the Imperium continues to rely on Titan's shipyards for fleet support, Saturn's industrial environment remains relevant. It is not a thriving ecosystem, nor a fully functional production empire, but a durable remnant of humanity's oldest expansionate ambitions. The fate of the system mirrors the fate of the Imperium itself, partially preserved, partially decayed, and sustained by resilience rather than renewal. The shipyards of Saturn entered the attention of the Adeptus Administratum long before the Mechanicus began its deeper technical assessment. Surviving documents indicate that the first impressions recorded by Administratum clerks focused on the stability of output rather than the strategic magnitude of what the Saturnine orbit would eventually produce. Their earliest reports described a large but orderly ring of manufactories and docking frameworks extending across the outer exosphere of the planet with steady production metrics that aligned with the expectations set by the wider Sol System development plan. These reports did not yet capture the later transformation of the site into one of the Imperium's most essential naval construction hubs. Instead, the documentation process began as a routine assessment of an off-Terra industrial expansion that required predictable tithe patterns and compliance with baseline regulations. The Administratum's approach to new infrastructure followed a stable pattern that had been seen across other locations in the system. A census of workforce distribution was assembled first, followed by a projection of resource requirements, transport rotations, and efficiency forecasts. For the Saturnine structure, this was complicated by the presence of multiple orbital layers and varying levels of Mechanicus oversight. The earliest scribes noted that the workers assigned to the construction platforms demonstrated consistent discipline, low attrition, and minimal unrest. These details were recorded because the Administratum evaluated all factors connected to productivity, including morale, physical strain, and the logistical reality of maintaining life support for thousands of individuals in microgravity. The Mechanicus addressed the shipyards from an entirely different perspective. Instead of population stability, they evaluated tolerances, stress loads, material fatigue, and compatibility between Terra-designed frameworks and Saturn orbit-specific conditions. Their tech priests filed extensive observations regarding temperature gradients, fluctuating radiation belts, and the long-term wear on support arms exposed to decades of constant pressure changes. They preferred to document each dataset within separate archives, resulting in slow but thorough information build-up. Saturn's orbit offered a clean, unobstructed manufacturing region compared to the more congested Terra-adjacent stations, but its gravitational resonance and magnetic field created irregular strains that the Mechanicus considered valuable for testing new alloys and reinforcement techniques. The documentation procedure therefore extended into a scientific assessment that went far beyond the Administratum's practical expectations. The joint records reveal that both factions attempted to standardize a unified reporting method, though neither side relinquished its own process. The Administratum valued clarity and repeatability, while the Mechanicus demanded precise transcription of machine data that could shift considerably from cycle to cycle. This resulted in two parallel streams of archival material. The first documented cost, productivity, and projected tithe requirements. The second documented strain tolerances, adaptive engineering results, and performance analyses of the shipyard's evolving systems. Each archive reflected its creator's worldview, yet both contributed to the broader understanding of the construction complex. The earliest impressions recorded by the Administratum speak of the shipyards as a promising but unremarkable component of Saturn's industrial arc. These impressions shifted dramatically over time. As the scale of naval projects increased, new forms of logistical strain appeared. Material had to be transported from Titan, Ganymede, Luna and Terra in timed cycles. The Administratum documented each stage of this progression with care, noting the exact impact of delays, weather shifts on Titan that affected mining output, and the narrow window in which transport fleets could maintain synchronized arrival times. These details mattered because the Sol system was rebuilding itself across multiple fronts, and any bottleneck would jeopardize vessel construction plans intended for the wider Imperial Navy. The Mechanicus impressions were shaped instead by the complexity of Saturn's orbital conditions. Their records describe the shipyards as a testing bed for multi-stage drydock platforms that could reconfigure themselves depending on the type of vessel being assembled. They regarded the region as an engine of innovation. Each new hull pattern, each modification to a lance battery array, and each reinforcement batch applied to warship keels was analysed in consideration of how the environment influenced performance. These impressions affected later Mechanicus decisions, including the installation of modular superstructures that allowed the shipyards to build multiple classes of vessels simultaneously. Their approach was not purely industrial, it was experimental, which shaped the documentation culture that surrounded the entire complex. The procedure of documentation changed as the shipyards expanded. Initially dominated by straightforward tallies, the Administratum revised its reporting method to account for the increased number of variables. Orbital accidents were recorded more frequently due to the dense traffic around the construction arms. The records note shifts in workforce management as thousands more personnel were rotated through microgravity environments. They also documented the gradual increase in Mechanicus authority, which required new forms of bureaucratic cooperation. These records did not take sides. They simply noted the friction caused by overlapping jurisdictions and the procedural adjustments needed to keep output steady. In contrast, the Mechanicus developed more compartmentalized data streams. Different wards documented reactor tests, magnetic sealing performance, void shielding integration, and atmospheric retention across the enclosed sections of the shipyards. Each of these assessments required independent sign-off procedures that generated a large volume of data. Over time, this created a layered picture of the shipyards, showing how each segment behaved under different load conditions and how these changes affected long-term production schedules. The Mechanicus precision often conflicted with the Administratum's preference for simplicity, which resulted in several revisions to baseline reporting formats to ensure both factions understood each other's findings. The documentation process for incoming raw material formed another core element. Administratum scribes recorded tonnage, purity, allocation targets, and transport origin. Mechanicus evaluators recorded resonance quality, molecular composition, and fusibility index for each shipment. When a material batch proved unsuitable for high-pressure structural components, the administratum required documentation of the reallocation process, while the mechanicus required analysis explaining the cause of failure. These dual records became essential for predicting future production cycles and identifying consistent shortfalls in raw material quality. Another element repeatedly documented by both factions was energy consumption. Saturn's distance from Terra required storage strategies that minimized loss across transfer conduits. The administratum tracked energy inputs across the operational cycle of each construction block, ensuring that the shipyards never exceeded their power budget. The mechanicus focused instead on the efficiency of transfer mechanisms, capacitor recharge rates, and the impact of Saturn's radiation environment on sensitive circuitry. The shipyard's power requirements grew exponentially with each new vessel class, forcing both institutions to adapt their documentation procedures. The administratum updated its consumption projections, while the mechanicus sought new energy optimization methods. A significant portion of the surviving records discusses environmental containment and hazard mitigation. Administratum records captured the impact of micrometeoroid storms, solar flare events, and occasional structural failures. These documented the operational disruptions caused by environmental hazards and assessed the resulting delays in construction schedules. Mechanicus records captured each hazard's mechanical implications, the performance of reinforced shielding, and the efficacy of hull integrity systems designed to keep the shipyards functional during adverse conditions. The complexity of Saturn's orbital debris patterns became a recurring topic, influencing future construction phases and shaping the maintenance timeline for exterior platforms. During periods of heightened conflict elsewhere in the Imperium, both factions intensified documentation. Administratum reports emphasized the urgency of meeting fleet construction quotas. Mechanicus records emphasized the need for new optimization methods that would preserve efficiency even under increased operational pressure. These dual perspectives created a fuller picture of how the shipyards responded to strategic demands. Despite occasional disagreements, the administratum valued predictability while the mechanicus valued adaptability. This contrast shaped the entire workflow of the shipyards and the way their documentation was preserved. As the shipyards increased in scale, documentation also expanded to cover the growing influence of nearby moons, particularly Titan. Administratum records described Titan as a stabilizing logistical base. Mechanicus records describe Titan as a source of unique material composites suited for specialized hull components. These impressions influenced how the institutions interpreted the broader Saturnine production ecosystem, reflecting a shared recognition that the shipyards existed within a larger and interconnected industrial network. Another major component of documentation involved fleet trials. The administrator monitored each vessel's progression from initial assembly to launch approval. Their reports noted compliance benchmarks and tracked how many days each stage of construction required. Mechanicus data captured the performance of newly installed systems, including warp drive calibration, engine output, and void shielding response. These trial phases became essential sources of information for refining both construction standards and future projections. The administrative and mechanical impressions of the shipyards changed once more following several high-profile naval campaigns. The administratum became increasingly concerned with sustaining consistent ship production to compensate for wartime losses. Their reports reflected anxiety over missing resources and unpredictable transport cycles. Mechanicus reports reflected a different concern, maintaining the shipyard's internal stability during periods of overextension. They documented structural stress, unexpected system fatigue, and the rapid degradation of certain machine components under increased load conditions. These records demonstrated how wartime pressure could strain even a facility as advanced as the Saturn shipyards. Throughout this evolution, both institutions adhered to documentation rituals that preserved uniformity. The administratum favored daily reports, weekly consolidation, and monthly output assessments. The mechanicus favored cycle-based evaluations tied to machine performance and environmental readings. The coexistence of these two systems allowed later archivists to reconstruct a precise timeline of the shipyard's growth, difficulties, and operational milestones. One of the most revealing aspects of their documentation was how each institution reacted to internal anomalies. Administratum clerks logged such events when they affected schedules or personnel distribution. Mechanicus logs captured these events when they indicated systemic inconsistencies or unexpected machine behavior. When minor power fluctuations began occurring across several docking arms, the Administratum documented the resulting delays, while the Mechanicus documented the structural and energetic instability that caused them. These dual records helped identify larger patterns that neither institution could see alone. The combined impressions of the Administratum and the Mechanicus form a cohesive account of how the Saturn shipyards developed from a modest industrial platform into one of the most significant naval construction sites in the Sol system. Their records track its expansion, adaptation, and operational complexity without resorting to interpretation or dramatization. Instead, they preserve the factual progression of a structure that grew in response to technological demands, strategic necessity, and the Imperium's evolving naval doctrine. The documentation procedures themselves reflect the character of each institution. The Administratum presents the shipyards as a vast logistical undertaking that required precise regulation. The Mechanicus presents the shipyards as a dynamic machine whose performance had to be measured, tested, and refined. Together, these perspectives shape the foundation of the historical record, creating an objective image of a location that would later become central to Imperial fleet construction and long-term strategic planning. The geological analytics concerning the Saturn region were compiled gradually, as neither the Adeptus Administratum nor the Adeptus Mechanicus initially regarded the planet as a subject requiring physical survey comparable to terrestrial worlds. Saturn presented no solid crust suitable for conventional extraction or habitation, and its atmospheric layers were too unstable for permanent stations. Yet the Mechanicus insisted that a complete geological adjacent analysis was required, not because the planet offered traditional rock strata, but because its gravity, magnetic fields, and atmospheric composition directly influenced the long-term structural stability of any orbital construction. This led to a unique set of geological surveys that focused less on the surface and more on the environmental forces surrounding the planet. The Mechanicus considered Saturn's gravity the primary geological factor of interest. Their surveys documented the pull gradients across orbit, particularly the transition zones where tidal forces became strong enough to affect platform alignment. The shipyards were situated within a stable band where these forces remained manageable, yet every movement of the planet's atmosphere caused measurable fluctuations. Mechanicus documenters compiled long sequences of data on how these fluctuations altered the stress loads on structural moorings. Over decades, this effort produced a detailed understanding of orbital tolerances that would later shape the engineering logic of the entire shipyard complex. The second geological factor centered on the influence of Saturn's magnetic field. Its strength exceeded that of many other gas giants, and the radiation belts it generated produced steady interference across sensors, circuitry, and data transmission lines. Mechanicus archivists conducted spectral analyses to map the intensity patterns across different orbital heights. They determined which areas produced the least interference and recommended the construction of the shipyards in the region where radiation spikes remained predictable across long cycles. These findings were critical, as initial attempts to install docking arms in less stable zones resulted in repeated sensor dropouts and unreliable shielding performance. Although Saturn lacked solid land masses, its rings provided a separate category of geological interest. Administratum records described the rings only in terms of their hazard potential, noting the density of microdebris and the predictable sweep of larger ice fragments. Mechanicus records went deeper, analysing the composition of ring material and its conductive properties when struck by solar radiation. These analytics proved essential for determining the durability standards of the shipyard's outer structures. Even minor ice fragments could reach velocities sufficient to damage incomplete hulls, and Mechanicus stress logs documented the required reinforcement levels to counter this threat. These details influenced both the placement of exterior platforms and the sequence in which new warships were armoured during early assembly. Further geological evaluation concerned the atmospheric composition of Saturn itself. Though the gas layers held no resource value in the traditional sense, their hydrogen content produced distinct energetic behaviour during solar storms. Documents recorded by the Administratum noted periodic increases in static buildup across metal surfaces. The Mechanicus correlated these observations with atmospheric agitation in Saturn's upper layers. This link allowed them to construct predictive models that determined when the shipyards should reduce external activity to avoid electrical surges. Over time, this became a standard procedural safeguard, embedded into the operational workflow of every outer yard labour rotation. Despite lacking conventional resources, Saturn's moons played a significant role in the broader geological analytics. Titan, Rhea, and Enceladus were documented extensively. Titan, with its dense and chemically rich environment, became the primary source of complex industrial compounds. Geological surveys from Titan recorded hydrocarbon reservoirs, cryovolcanic activity, and stable plateaus where mining posts could operate without long-term structural degradation. These findings provided the Mechanicus with a reliable supply chain for specific polymers and chemical stabilizers used in hull insulation and internal ship systems. Administratum records focused instead on Titan's logistical capacity, noting that its gravity allowed easy launch windows for cargo craft heading towards Saturn's orbit. Rhea and its stable terrain offered metal ores processed into low-weight components, while Enceladus provided volatile compounds essential for certain types of experimental reactor coolant. Though these moons were not part of the Saturn shipyards directly, their geological stability formed an unbroken logistical chain supporting the shipyard's industrial expansion. The Administratum identified them as secondary strategic assets, and Mechanicus reports reinforced this view by documenting the properties of extracted resources and their compatibility with shipyard needs. The deeper analytics of Saturn's orbital pathways revealed long-term patterns that shaped future shipyard expansions. Mechanicus predictions showed that specific rotational alignments created narrow windows of reduced debris density lasting only minutes or hours. These windows proved ideal for cargo transfers, exterior repairs, and adjustments to the largest construction arms. Administratum reports recorded the operational gains achieved during these windows and emphasized the importance of synchronization between transport fleets and orbital shift cycles. This synchronization became a defining feature of Saturn's industrial rhythm. The strategic value of the shipyards emerged gradually as their productivity became intertwined with the Imperium's naval requirements. In the earliest records, the Administratum referred to Saturn's shipyards as a secondary facility, supporting the more established construction centres near Terra and Mars. As the Sol system underwent reconstruction after major conflicts, the importance of Saturn increased significantly. Its orbital stability and vast surrounding space made it ideal for the assembly of large-frame vessels. Administratum documentation from this period noted the necessity of expanding the fleet to meet rising demands, and their evaluations gradually reclassified the Saturn shipyards as essential infrastructure. The Mechanicus assigned strategic value according to different criteria. Their records emphasized the shipyard's unique ability to support experimental engineering programs. Saturn's orbital environment produced consistent stress conditions that tested new hull types and weapon systems. These tests yielded data that shaped new naval doctrines. Mechanicus archives described the shipyards as a critical environment where emerging technologies could be validated before mass deployment. The combination of steady manufacturing output and advanced testing conditions created a strategic synergy unmatched by other shipyards in the Sol system. Administratum analysis focused on the shipyard's role in naval distribution. Positioned far enough from Terra to avoid orbital congestion, but close enough to maintain streamlined supply chains, the Saturn complex acted as a staging point for several major fleet deployments. Documents note that vessels emerging from the shipyards could be dispatched toward multiple outer system routes, without causing traffic conflicts near Terra. This made Saturn one of the most efficient points for launching patrol groups, exploratory fleets, and rapid response squadrons. Mechanicus records added another layer to the strategic picture by examining Saturn's position within the Sol defense grid. Its location allowed shipyards to operate under the protective umbrella of system-wide defense assets, including long-range Auspex arrays on lunar and weapon platforms near Mars. This protection ensured that large warships could be assembled without constant threat of disruption. Mechanicus evaluators considered the shipyard's placement ideal for sustaining long-term naval readiness even in periods of major military pressure. Over time, geostrategic assessments expanded to include the shipyard's influence on system-wide logistics. Administratum evaluations observed that fleets departing from Saturn could link easily with supply chains running through Jupiter, the asteroid belt, and the Mars-Terra nexus. The shipyards therefore functioned as a midpoint in the Sol industrial network. This midpoint position allowed the administratum to redirect resources or vessels depending on the demands of the period. Mechanicus reports supported this analysis by documenting the mechanical compatibility of Saturn-assembled vessels with refit stations distributed throughout the system. The geological analytics also shaped the long-term durability strategy for the shipyards themselves. Mechanicus records revealed that certain orbital layers experienced gradual shifts in debris distribution over decades. These shifts required periodic repositioning of construction arms and replacement of shields that had thinned due to constant particle erosion. Administratum logs recorded the administrative consequences of these maintenance cycles, including resource expenditures and schedule adjustments. Together, these dual records demonstrated that the shipyards required ongoing adaptation to maintain optimal function. Strategic analysis conducted during periods of conflict reinforced the shipyard's importance. Administratum reports highlighted the necessity of accelerating output to compensate for war losses. Mechanicus reports emphasized the need for sustained quality despite increased production pressures. Saturn's orbital conditions proved advantageous in this regard. Its wide orbital space allowed multiple large vessels to be assembled in parallel without interference. Documents show that this parallel assembly capability became a decisive factor during several periods of high demand. The shipyard's ability to produce capital ships and escorts at a predictable rate made them one of the most reliable assets in the Sol system. The strategic value also extended into technological continuity. Mechanicus archives describe Saturn as a location where long-term engineering projects could be preserved even during crises. The stable orbital environment reduced the risk of catastrophic disruption, ensuring that decades-long research programs could continue without major interruption. These programs included improvements to void shielding, reactor containment, and hull reinforcement. The ability to maintain these projects across generations increased the Mechanicus reliance on the shipyards as a center of technical preservation. Administratum evaluations further recognized the political importance of the shipyards. As output increased, the shipyards became an economic anchor for several moons, drawing labor, resources, and administrative attention. The Administratum documented this stabilizing influence and gradually incorporated the shipyards into broader system-wide planning. The shipyard's strategic value therefore extended beyond production, shaping the political and logistical structure of the outer Sol system. Toward the later stages of recorded development, both institutions documented the growing complexity of Saturn's industrial footprint. As new platforms, cranes, and orbital modules were added, the shipyards formed an interconnected web that expanded across a wide orbital band. Mechanicus mineralogical sensors tracked how this structure influenced micro-debris flow patterns. Administratum reports tracked how the new expansions altered traffic routes and cargo schedules. These findings proved essential for maintaining long-term stability as the shipyards approached their maximum industrial capacity. In summary, the geological findings and strategic analyses surrounding the Saturn shipyards reveal a location shaped not by rock strata or conventional terrain, but by gravitational forces, magnetic fields, ring debris, and the logistical relationship between Saturn and its moons. These factors defined both the engineering approach of the Mechanicus and the administrative evaluations of the Administratum. Together, they established the shipyards as one of the most strategically valuable sites in the Sol system, capable of sustaining high-volume production, long-term testing, and system-wide fleet coordination across multiple eras of Imperial history. The Administratum catalogued the resources of the Saturn shipyards in terms that reflected its established approach to strategic classification. Although Saturn itself could not be mined in the conventional sense, the system offered a layered network of material supply, energy potential, and unique scientific conditions that supported the shipyard's expanding operations. These elements were never viewed in isolation. Instead, the Administratum evaluated how each potential resource fit into the broader infrastructure of the Sol system. Mechanicus records continued this line of analysis by examining the scientific value behind these same elements, emphasizing how the environment contributed to technological advancement. The first category of potential resources documented by the Administratum concerned the Saturnian moons. Titan remained the most significant due to its reservoirs of hydrocarbons and complex organic compounds. The Administratum identified these materials as essential for several categories of industrial production, ranging from internal ship insulation to chemical stabilizers for ammunition and reactor coolant. Mechanicus analysts provided further detail by explaining how Titan's atmospheric and surface chemistry offered a consistent supply of materials that resisted breakdown during prolonged storage. This stability made Titan a crucial support node for the shipyard's long-term logistics. Rhea, Tethys, and Iapetus formed the second tier of resource contributors. Administratum data focused on the ores extracted from their icy crusts, which were refined into lightweight alloys. These alloys were used in structural components that did not require full adamantine reinforcement. Mechanicus archives examined these metals at a molecular level, identifying the precise processes that allowed them to integrate into larger assemblies. Their analyses recorded how these alloys withstood the vibration cycles experienced in Saturn orbit, providing a viable supplement to the heavier metals transported from Mars. This dual evaluation demonstrated how the Moon's geological characteristics directly shaped the shipyard's industrial efficiency. Enceladus, with its volatile-rich subsurface reservoirs, became the source of materials required for experimental coolant systems. Administratum records acknowledged the strategic value of these materials, but focused primarily on the logistical challenge of extracting and transporting them. Mechanicus records placed greater emphasis on the scientific implications. The volatile compounds retrieved from Enceladus were used not only for coolant systems, but also for long-duration testing environments that simulated extreme reactor conditions. These experiments generated insights that contributed to refining plasma conduits and improving reactor shielding. Another category of potential resources identified by the Administratum concerned the energy environment of Saturn's orbit. Although the shipyards did not extract energy from the planet directly, they operated within a region where solar radiation, magnetic field fluctuations, and gravitational gradients could be harnessed indirectly. Administratum evaluation focused on the reliability of energy transfer from the Sol power grid, which supplied the shipyards through a layered relay network involving both Mars and Terra. Mechanicus reports expanded on this by documenting experiments that studied how Saturn's magnetic field influenced energy distribution. These experiments helped refine power conduction lines and shielding systems, which later improved the overall efficiency of shipyard operations. The shipyards also benefited from a classification of environmental resources, a category created by the Administratum to describe conditions that enabled large-scale industrial production. This included the wide orbital space around Saturn, which minimized the risk of accidental collisions during the assembly of large vessels. Mechanicus logs supported this view by documenting how the orbital bands remained stable enough for the construction of vessels with hull lengths that could not safely be assembled near Terra or Mars. The spatial conditions functioned as a resource in themselves, enabling production that would have been impossible elsewhere in the Sol system. From the perspective of scientific research, The Saturn shipyards provided the Mechanicus with a range of benefits that extended far beyond their role as a manufacturing facility. The gravitational environment offered a natural laboratory for testing hull resilience, void shielding, and structural integrity under continuous stress. Mechanicus archivists documented long-term experiments where specific hull geometries were exposed to orbital shear forces and magnetic interference. These experiments generated data that informed the design of several capital ship classes. Administratum records acknowledged the strategic value of these experiments, but focused primarily on their impact on long-term fleet readiness. Another significant scientific benefit emerged from Saturn's radiation environment. Mechanicus researchers used the variable intensity of the radiation belts to evaluate how different materials degraded over time. These evaluations produced new composite materials with improved resistance to radiation-induced brittleness. As a result, future vessels constructed in the shipyards demonstrated increased durability when deployed in outer system patrol routes or warp-adjacent missions. The Administratum documented these improvements as part of their strategic evaluation, noting that the increased durability reduced long-term maintenance costs. The presence of the rings formed an additional scientific resource. Mechanicus engineers used the rings' predictable debris patterns to test impact shielding systems. Controlled experiments involved deploying plates, alloys, and smaller hull sections into areas of moderate debris density. The resulting data formed the basis for several shielding improvements. Administratum reports logged these developments in terms of resource allocation and overall fleet benefit, but the Mechanicus saw the rings as an ongoing experimental environment that provided insights unavailable elsewhere in the Sol system. Saturn's moons also contributed to scientific advancement. Titan's atmospheric pressure allowed for controlled testing of atmospheric entry systems and landing thrusters. Enceladus provided a unique environment for thermal stress experiments. Rhea's low gravity became the testing ground for equipment designed for operations on other low-gravity worlds. The Mechanicus regarded this network of experiments as a unified system of scientific opportunity surrounding the shipyards. Administratum records supported this classification by identifying the moons as integrated research zones rather than isolated resource sites. Administratum documentation of strategic benefits emphasized the shipyard's role in sustaining fleet expansion. They noted that vessels constructed at Saturn could be deployed toward outer system sectors without interfering with Terra's traffic patterns. They also recorded the shipyard's increasing importance as a reserve manufacturing hub during periods when Mars or Terra faced operational strain. Saturn became a stabilizing force within the Sol industrial network. Mechanicus reports framed this stability as the product of environmental factors, engineering capacity, and resource integration. Final analyses produced jointly by the Administratum and the Mechanicus offered a comprehensive interpretation of the shipyard's value. Administratum conclusions emphasized the importance of Saturn's location. Its orbital position formed a midpoint between the inner system industrial centers and the outer system defense corridors. This positioning allowed for rapid redistribution of vessels to multiple strategic fronts. The Administratum also observed that the shipyard's output directly supported fleet flexibility during crises, enabling the Sol system to maintain readiness across extended periods. Mechanicus' final analysis differed primarily in focus. Their conclusions centered on the technological benefits derived from the environment. They emphasized that Saturn's gravitational gradients, radiation fields, and debris-rich orbital layers created a naturally challenging environment where emerging technologies could be tested rigorously. The shipyards became a center for long-term experimental programs that continued even during major conflicts. Mechanicus archivists noted that these programs contributed to a deeper understanding of structural dynamics, reactor stability, and shield modulation across generations. The joint analysis identified that Saturn's moons formed a secondary network supporting the shipyard's long-term viability. Their geological stability and predictable resource content provided consistent supply chains for materials that could not be produced efficiently elsewhere. Administratum records highlighted the logistical continuity offered by these moons, while Mechanicus records focused on the scientific benefits derived from their diverse environments. The final assessment acknowledged that the shipyards of Saturn were not defined by traditional planetary resources. Instead, their value derived from a complex combination of orbital stability, environmental challenges, logistical connections, and scientific opportunities. These factors formed a unified system that allowed the shipyards to operate at a scale unmatched by other facilities in the Sol system. The Administratum classified the shipyards as an essential asset, necessary for sustaining naval power across both stable and unstable eras. The Mechanicus classified them as an irreplaceable environment where engineering and experimentation could progress without interruption. Together, their combined perspective recognized that Saturn provided both the space and the conditions required for continuous ship production, technological testing, and strategic stability. The shipyard's importance did not arise from singular elements, but from the interaction of its moons, its gravity, its radiation, and its position within the Sol network. The final conclusion of both institutions affirmed that the Saturn shipyards formed one of the most critical industrial and scientific infrastructures in Imperial history, with a value that extended beyond material resources and into the realm of long-term systemic resilience. The Inquisition's earliest impressions of the shipyards of Saturn emerged from a series of compartmentalized audits, initiated long before open scrutiny was considered acceptable. Their interest did not stem from any singular breach, but from a pattern of unusual operational stability for a site exposed to constant strategic stress. Most installations of comparable scale showed a long, predictable trail of irregularities, minor sabotage attempts, or administrative friction that accumulated over decades. Saturn's shipyards, by contrast, presented a record so clean that it produced the opposite effect. Anomalies in Imperial data rarely manifested as noise or chaos. Just as often, they appeared as silence, a mission so precise that the absence itself demanded intervention. The Inquisition noted this silence first, and it shaped their foundational suspicion. During the first wave of examinations, observers highlighted how the shipyards maintained remarkably consistent productivity, even during system-wide disruptions. Astropathic delays, logistics slowdowns, or conflicts in nearby theatres normally produced measurable drops in output. Saturn did not follow this pattern. Instead, the site demonstrated an almost anticipatory adaptation to crises, pivoting personnel schedules, power availability, and manufactorum cycles with minimal lag. While the Administratum labelled this as evidence of competent leadership, inquisitorial observers flagged it as statistically improbable. They were not drawn to the idea of intentional manipulation, but rather to the possibility that some external factor, unknown or unacknowledged, might be aiding the shipyard's ability to maintain order during disorder. The next layer of observation focused on human behaviour within the facility. Inquisitorial field analysts reported that personnel across all ranks displayed a near-uniform adherence to procedure. This was not presented as a problem. Uniformity was, after all, foundational to Imperial stability, yet the consistency on Saturn was so pronounced that it blurred the usual indicators of interpersonal variance. Emotional drift, minor resentments, crew fatigue, and the micro-conflicts that accompany any large workforce appeared unusually suppressed. Workers did not avoid conflict so much as they seemed to lack the impulse to generate it. Daily logs, disciplinary records, and Medikey reports supported the same conclusion. Saturn's crews were not artificially conditioned or augmented in ways that could explain the behaviour. They were simply predictable, too predictable for the Inquisition's liking. A separate concern emerged regarding the shipyard's mechanical and environmental sensors. Over several centuries, there were intermittent but repeating discrepancies in pressure readings, internal gravimetric shifts, and microfluctuations in the electromagnetic field surrounding several of the construction arms. None of these deviations threatened the structural integrity of the facility, and none produced harm or loss of material. The Mechanicus attributed them to natural wear across such colossal machinery. Yet frequency patterns extracted from the archives did not follow wear and tear trajectories. They followed rhythmic cycles, recurring in intervals too mathematically clean to be dismissed as mechanical erosion. Inquisitorial analysts lacked a definitive interpretation, but logged the pattern as an unresolved phenomenon. While conducting deeper evaluations, Inquisition personnel uncovered another irregularity within the shipyard's archival stacks. Several operational reports were duplicated across separate decades, with only minor changes in nomenclature or numeric detail. These were not cases of clerical reuse or template errors. The duplications had been processed, authenticated, and archived by different generations of Adeptus Administratum scribes. No functional explanation satisfied the question of why near-identical reports existed with such chronological separation. Attempts to trace the original authorship led to incomplete dossiers or personnel records that ended abruptly without cause, as though the contributors had quietly vanished or been reassigned without documentation. The Administratum insisted this was an error generated during the Age of Dark Compliance, but the temporal inconsistencies did not align with that period. In addition to these documentary concerns, the Inquisition documented several instances where entire subsectors of the shipyards registered short outages in cogitator computation. During these interruptions, mechanical systems continued without error, and no physical processes halted. The only measurable impact was the absence of recorded data for the duration of the outage. This lack of recorded history was, in the Inquisition's estimation, more concerning than any active malfunction. Missing data acted as an informational void which could conceal external tampering or internal alteration. The Mechanicus maintained that these outages aligned with routine recalibration cycles, yet such cycles were never officially scheduled, and no tech priest claimed responsibility for authorizing them. Another persistent observation involved the shipyard's long-range Auspex systems. Several scans recorded faint returns that did not correspond to physical mass signatures, nor did they match common void debris or known energy patterns. These echoes appeared sporadically and disappeared before deeper analyses could be conducted. Internal reports compared them to phantom signatures observed in other major industrial zones near gravitic stresses, but none of those comparisons fully explained the phenomenon. The Inquisition did not classify the anomaly as a threat, only as a recurring unknown worth continued attention. As investigations broadened, Inquisition personnel also noted sporadic discrepancies in voice pattern logs used for security authentication. Certain high-ranking clearance codes triggered subtle waveform deviations that were statistically unlikely to occur naturally. Although each deviation was minor enough to pass routine verification, the aggregate data suggested the presence of an unrecognized environmental influence affecting audio processing. The Mechanicus hypothesized atmospheric resonance caused by the shipyard's massive internal caverns. The Inquisition flagged the explanation as insufficient due to inconsistent spatial distribution of the phenomenon. Throughout all analyses, no evidence emerged to imply malign intent, Xenos presence, warp activity, or internal subversion. That absence itself became a core observation. Saturn's shipyards were not clean because they were well managed. They were clean in a manner that defied natural administrative drift. The Inquisition maintained a watch not because of danger, but because the anomalies refused to settle into a coherent pattern. A place that produced so much for the Imperium, so reliably, could not afford unanswered questions. In their assessment, the shipyards operated as though guided by processes that extended beyond the limits of recorded protocol. The Inquisition never claimed those processes were dangerous, only that they were unaccounted for. The Shipyards of Saturn produced material artifacts on a scale that dwarfed most orbital manufactoria, yet the items documented by the Inquisition typically fell outside expected inventories. Their relevance was not tied to military capability, but to informational irregularity. Across multiple centuries of oversight, scattered reports described the recovery of non-standard components embedded within the substructures of the facility, often found during routine maintenance or expansion projects. These components did not match Mechanicus design patterns and lacked identifiable fabrication markers, They were metallic, geometrically precise, and consistently resistant to standard analysis. Each discovery prompted quiet removal by authorized officials before administration personnel could record them in open logs. In one instance, a maintenance crew uncovered a compact assembly of interlocking plates concealed within a redundant support conduit. Although inert to conventional Auspex scans, its internal surfaces displayed microscopic etchings arranged with mathematical symmetry. The Mechanicus teams assigned to the find noted that the geometry resembled pre-Imperial engineering motifs, yet the absence of corrosion and the precision of the etching suggested a far more recent origin. The Inquisition archived the object under restricted classification, citing concerns that the material composition displayed properties inconsistent with any known Saturnite alloy. No destructive testing was approved, and the fragment was relocated to a sealed research hold where it remained without further study. Another artifact emerged during refitting operations along one of the external construction trusses. Workers identified a cylindrical shell fused into an inaccessible corner of the assembly, where no prior documentation suggested the presence of foreign material. The object produced a subtle harmonic resonance when subjected to external pressure, a phenomenon difficult to classify because it persisted even in vacuum conditions. Although the Mechanicus attempted to trace the frequency pattern, its modulation shifted unpredictably, preventing the establishment of a stable baseline. The Inquisition categorized the resonance as non-threatening but unusual, and the object was removed from the shipyards before local personnel could establish speculative explanations. Occasionally, the artifacts discovered appeared to be fragments rather than complete mechanisms. These fragments typically emerged during deep structure audits in the oldest sections of the shipyards, areas constructed during the earliest days of the Imperium's expansion into the system. Some fragments possessed crystalline inclusions that refracted electromagnetic signals in ways that produced blurred data returns across multiple instruments. These returns, while not indicative of warp phenomena, displayed interference patterns common in regions under prolonged exposure to gravimetric stress. The Inquisition noted that the interference did not resemble any known failure mode of shipyard material, and thus the fragments were considered anomalous enough to warrant extraction and censorship. Knowledge regarding these discoveries became progressively restricted over time. Initial documentation circulated among several Mechanicus research cohorts, but as more objects surfaced with similarly unclassifiable traits, the Inquisition narrowed the flow of information to minimize hypothesis proliferation. The official justification centered on preventing misinterpretation that might lead to destabilizing conclusions about the site's origins or development. To enforce this, several archived segments of early construction records were sealed under priority protocols. The rationale for the censorship was not that the records contained explicit evidence of non-imperial influence, but that their omissions aligned too closely with the locations where anomalous objects were found. The process of knowledge restriction extended beyond physical artifacts. Several corridors of historical documentation related to Saturn's initial orbital frameworks were quietly removed from public Mechanicus access pools. Researchers attempting to trace the evolution of early dock architecture encountered abrupt interruptions in the chronology, where construction plans jumped forward without accounting for intermediary phases. The Inquisition cited potential corruption or duplication errors in the original data as the reason for removal, yet the patterns of absence followed a coherent trajectory. All missing sections corresponded to moments when the shipyards underwent redesigns based not on necessity, but on unexplained internal directives. These directives lacked signatures and carried authorization codes no longer recognized by modern systems. There were also incidents where personnel described encountering isolated structural irregularities during inspection tasks, smooth cavities, asymmetrical reinforcements, or crossbeams made of alloys not listed in the site's supply inventory. These reports were logged but later edited, with references to specific materials or locations removed before final storage. Workers involved in these reports were transferred to other stations without explanation. The Inquisition maintained that such edits were precautionary rather than punitive, intended to prevent misalignment between observed phenomena and official structural schematics. Beyond the redaction, no disciplinary markers accompanied the transfers. What little remained uncensored revealed a consistent pattern. Every anomaly, whether an artifact or architectural aberration, surfaced in regions of the shipyards constructed before the most complete records existed. The Inquisition did not attempt to postulate origins. Their concerns centered on controlling interpretive pathways that might destabilize confidence in the shipyard's operational heritage. Imperial infrastructure depended not only on material reliability, but informational cohesion. Any suggestion that foundational elements of the shipyards lacked documented lineage was therefore treated as a risk to systemic morale and logistical continuity. Later reviews of censored knowledge focused on preventing unauthorized analysis rather than concealing explicit danger. The artifacts were inert, the structures stable, and none of the findings suggested a threat. However, the inability to determine provenance placed the shipyards in an ambiguous historical bracket. Such ambiguity was unacceptable for a site central to fleet construction. In response, the Inquisition maintained tight stewardship over all records associated with the anomalies. Their stance emphasized containment through definition. If something could not be explained, it could at least be managed by restricting who knew it existed at all. Several of the picked feed archives associated with the shipyards were retained under restricted access due to irregularities in how they captured environmental data. The earliest recordings came from routine inspection flights conducted during the later centuries of Millennia 39, when survey drones were deployed to monitor structural endurance after thermal expansion cycles. One sequence displayed a minor distortion along a truss junction, where a beam appeared partially absent for a fraction of a second. The feed did not exhibit signs of corruption elsewhere. The absence lasted for less than a single frame, after which the structure returned to its expected configuration. Mechanicus analysts initially suspected a sensor desynchronization, but repeated reviews indicated that the distortion did not align with typical data interruption patterns. The Inquisition logged the clip as inconclusive and sealed it on the grounds that its interpretation remained contingent on variables outside confirmed technological behavior. Another set of pit feeds captured movement in regions assumed to be devoid of personnel. These recordings came from the lower access rings where maintenance drones traveled unaccompanied. In one sequence, a dull reflection passed across a bulkhead surface without an identifiable light source. The reflection moved with steady pace, matching neither the flight path of the drone nor any ambient luminescence expected from the shipyard's illumination cycles. The reflection retained shape continuity even when the drone adjusted its angle, maintaining the same rate of displacement relative to the corridor. There were no metallic components in the vicinity capable of producing such reflective anomalies. The Inquisition classified the recording as environmentally inconsistent yet non-threatening. It was stored without further inquiry. Eyewitness accounts were rarer and often less consistent. Most personnel in the shipyards operated within highly regulated schedules and rarely witnessed events outside ordinary mechanical behavior. Still, a few reports surfaced over the centuries. One technician described hearing a low-frequency hum during a solo inspection run while confirming load distribution across a support cradle. He noted that the sound seemed to originate from inside the structure rather than from external systems. At the time, no engines, furnaces, or pressurized systems were active in that area. The hum lasted several seconds before stopping abruptly. When the technician attempted to repeat the inspection later, no sound occurred. Mechanical engineers attributed the noise to transient thermal shift, yet no data supported this explanation. The Inquisition recorded the event as anecdotal and retained it without formal conclusion. Another worker stationed near the eastern service platform during a docking cycle reported observing a faint outline of geometric patterns across a panel surface that were not part of standard shipyard markings. She described them as angular lines that glowed for less than a second before disappearing. Her account was accompanied by a statement that she initially believed the markings were reflections from a passing shuttle, yet the shuttle's flight trajectory did not align with the location of the panel. The Mechanicus examined the surface and found no residual luminescence or structural alteration. The Inquisition retained the testimonial, and restricted its distribution to avoid the creation of interpretive narratives that lacked empirical grounding. Several picked feeds from later operational periods captured unexpected shadows moving across gantry walkways with no personnel recorded in the area. These shadows displayed coherent outlines but failed to correspond with physical figures. The feeds were examined for temporal desynchronization, but the movements were internally consistent within each recording. The Inquisition concluded that the shadows likely derived from mechanical elements outside the frame. Despite this assessment, the clips remained under sealed classification due to the absence of definitive source identification. Eyewitness recordings taken during outer ring expansions during the early centuries of millennia, 41 showed intermittent sensor brightening in several external panels. The brightening was brief, occurring over microseconds, and possessed no correlation with solar radiation levels or localized electrical activity. Engineers dismissed these events as static surges caused by exposure to unshielded cabling. The Inquisition noted that the surges appeared exclusively in regions where earlier undocumented structural elements had been found. As with other anomalies, no danger or instability was detected, and the panels remained operational. A particularly detailed testimonial originated from a senior structural overseer who had worked in the shipyards for nearly 5 decades. During a review of older support structures, he reported noticing a smooth inner recess along a load-bearing assembly that he insisted had not been present during earlier inspections. He described the recess as a narrow, polished cavity that blended seamlessly with the surrounding metal. No design schematics accounted for such a feature. When he returned with a survey team, the cavity was no longer visible, and the entire section appeared consistent with standard fabrication. His colleagues suggested memory error or misalignment of perspective. The overseer maintained confidence in his observation but accepted the absence of physical evidence. The Inquisition preserved his statement while declining to draw conclusions. Toward the later operational centuries, picked feeds recorded from long-range Auspex towers captured faint fluctuations in the thermal signatures of the outer hull. These fluctuations resembled rapid changes in temperature that occurred too quickly to align with normal conductive or radiative processes. The anomalies did not affect structural integrity and produced no damage or measurable stress. The Mechanicus monitored the variations briefly before concluding that they resulted from sensor drift. The Inquisition, recognizing a pattern of unexplained behavior across decades of observation, stored the data under sealed classification. Final thoughts recorded within the Inquisition's internal assessment highlighted a consistent stance. The anomalies associated with the shipyards did not suggest a direct threat to Imperial infrastructure, workforce safety, or strategic operations. None of the irregularities displayed attributes associated with warp corruption, Xenos influence, or technological contamination. The shipyards functioned as intended, generated immense output for the Imperial Navy, and remained structurally sound across millennia of service. The central concern for the Inquisition lay not in the consequences of these irregularities, but in their potential to disrupt the continuity of historical understanding. The shipyards possessed a clear, documented origin within the early Imperium, yet certain architectural inconsistencies, undocumented recesses, unidentifiable materials, and unexplained sensor returns implied that parts of the structure could not be fully traced through existing records. This ambiguity threatened the stability of institutional confidence more than any operational hazard. Therefore, the Inquisition adopted a policy of informational containment. Their objective was to ensure that the anomalies did not generate speculative frameworks among personnel or provoke unnecessary research efforts that diverted attention from functional priorities. The strategy relied on preserving documented irregularities in controlled archives, maintaining selective access, and restricting circulation to prevent interpretive errors. They allowed the shipyards to continue their role without intervention, believing that the inconsistencies, while persistent, posed no tangible harm. The final evaluation concluded that the shipyards represented one of many Imperial sites whose historical layers bore unexplained artifacts or undocumented construction patterns. These irregularities were understood as products of fragmented documentation during eras of rapid expansion. Without evidence of malign influence, the Inquisition regarded the anomalies as subjects for reserved monitoring rather than immediate resolution. Their final position emphasized continuity, utility, and stability. The shipyards, despite their inconsistencies, remained integral to the Imperium's logistical framework. Their anomalies were acknowledged, recorded, and tightly contained within the archives, where they would remain until further developments offered a clearer interpretive pathway.